night of luxury takes a shocking turn when an exclusive club patron demands security remove a black woman from the premises. But as the situation escalates, the truth behind her presence shakes the entire room. What happens when assumptions are challenged in the most unexpected way? Let us know in the comments below before we dive into this unbelievable story. She felt the stares the moment she stepped through the grand entrance. Tall, mahogany double doors with gold-trimmed handles parted like gates to another world, one where she clearly wasn't welcome. The hum of sophisticated chatter dulled as her heels clicked against the marble floor. Eyes flickered toward her, a few subtle, others openly questioning. She wasn't new to this feeling, but tonight something about the weight of their scrutiny made her shoulders stiffen a little more. Jade Parker adjusted the sleek black dress, hugging her curves, exuding confidence she wasn't entirely sure she felt. The lighting was dim, designed to give the elite an air of mystery, the chandeliers casting a golden glow over faces filled with self-importance. A live jazz band played softly in the corner, the sound elegant yet distant, as if reminding everyone they were somewhere special. She scanned the room. Tables were lined with expensive bottles of wine, designer handbags rested on laps, and whispers floated through the air, delicate and sharp. A club reserved for those who belonged. But who determined that? The members, their last names stitched into history, their money generations old? Jade had spent enough time navigating spaces like this to know how to play the game. Hold your head high, walk with purpose, speak with assurance. She made her way to the bar, ignoring the curious glances that followed. But someone wasn't willing to just watch. Across the room, Meredith Kingsley set down her flute of champagne with deliberate precision, eyes narrowing. She was in her mid-50s, draped in a navy blue gown that screamed old money, the kind of wealth that didn't come with labels. It simply was. Her manicured fingers curled around her clutch, knuckles whitening. What is she doing here? The words were hushed but sharp as she leaned toward the man beside her. Arthur Welling, a longtime member of the club, followed her gaze, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't answer immediately, swirling the bourbon in his glass as if contemplating whether he should entertain her indignation or ignore it. "I don't recognize her," Meredith continued, her tone shifting from curiosity to irritation. "Is she with someone? Surely she's not a member." Arthur exhaled through his nose, reluctant. "I don't know, Meredith. Maybe she's a guest." "Then she should have entered with her host," Meredith snapped. "You know the rules. Members only." Her disapproval hung in the air like thick perfume. Without another word, she reached for her phone. Jade had just taken a sip of her cocktail when the deep voice behind her made her pause. "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned, meeting the gaze of a broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit. "Security." She didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened around her glass. "Is there a problem?" The man's expression remained neutral, but there was an underlying firmness in his stance. "We need to confirm your membership or the name of the person who invited you tonight." Jade inhaled slowly. "Here we go." "I wasn't aware guests needed to be escorted in," she said, her voice level. "But if you must know, I'm waiting for someone." Security hesitated. Maybe it was the confidence in her tone, or maybe it was the way she held his gaze. Unapologetic. This wasn't a woman who snuck into places she didn't belong. But before he could respond, another voice cut in. "I'd like her removed." Jade turned toward the source, already knowing what she'd see before her eyes met Meredith's. The woman's expression was poised, but there was something beneath the surface, a quiet pleasure in exerting control. Security shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Kingsley, I just need to confirm. She doesn't belong here." Jade let out a slow, deliberate breath. "Not tonight." She set down her drink, tilting her head as she studied Meredith. "You don't even know who I am." Meredith's lips pursed. "I don't need to. I know who does and doesn't belong in this club." A few murmurs rippled through the nearby guests. The musicians continued playing, but the energy in the room shifted. Some sipped their drinks, pretending not to watch. Others turned fully in their seats, anticipation flickering in their eyes. Jade smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "You're certain about that?" Meredith's fingers twitched around her clutch, irritated by the audacity of the question. "I am," she said coolly. Jade reached into her purse, retrieving something before sliding it across the bar toward the security officer. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the information before they flickered in realization. And then, everything changed. The silence thickened. Security cleared his throat, stepping back. Meredith's smug expression wavered. "Well, remove her." The officer hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Kingsley, she is a member." Meredith blinked. "Excuse me?" Jade folded her arms, her gaze unwavering. "She's a member," security repeated. "Actually, one of our newest." The room shifted again, the air electric. Meredith's face went pale before it twisted into something ugly. "That's impossible. How?" Jade stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Did you ever think that maybe I don't need an invitation to be here? That maybe I don't have to justify my presence to you?" Meredith opened her mouth, then closed it. Jade took her time, letting the weight of the moment settle. "See the thing about places like this?" She gestured around. "They love to make sure the same people stay in power. But things are changing, whether you like it or not." Meredith's throat bobbed as she swallowed. Jade leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "Next time, before you call security, check the list." She straightened, exuding nothing but poise as she turned back toward the bar, picking up her drink with ease. The room was still. The tension hung, waiting. And then Natha chuckled. It was small at first, but it grew. A knowing sound, a realization, a shift. Meredith stiffened, feeling the change in the air, the loss of control. Jade took a sip of her cocktail, savoring the moment. Tonight wasn't just about belonging. It was about reminding them that the world was no longer just theirs to dictate. And the night was far from over. Meredith's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, her manicured fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass. The murmur of voices swelled around her, a mixture of intrigue and amusement flickering through the room like wildfire. She wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not in her own domain, and definitely not by someone like Jade Parker. Jade, meanwhile, remained at the bar, her expression unreadable as she sipped her cocktail, letting the moment stretch. She knew how this game was played. When people like Meredith lost control, they scrambled to reclaim it. The next move was predictable, and right on cue, Meredith turned sharply toward Arthur, her voice clipped. "You knew about this?" Arthur exhaled through his nose, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He wasn't an ally, but he also wasn't a fool. His silence had been strategic. Now, however, he decided to speak. "I had my suspicions," he admitted. His gaze flickered toward Jade, something almost amused behind his eyes. "I just wanted to see how far you'd take it." Meredith's jaw tensed, her carefully cultivated poise cracking at the edges. "You let me embarrass myself?" Arthur smirked. "I didn't let you do anything." Jade watched the exchange with mild curiosity. Meredith's anger wasn't about the club's exclusivity. It was about power, about maintaining the hierarchy she had benefited from her entire life. And now, for the first time, she had been caught off guard. But she wasn't the type to let things go. Straightening her shoulders, Meredith's gaze sharpened. "That membership list is private," she said. "New members must be approved by the board." "How did this happen?" Jade finally spoke, her voice measured. "You'd have to ask your board." The answer only deepened the lines in Meredith's forehead. "You mean to tell me you didn't pull strings?" Jade's lips quirked. "Why would I have to?" Meredith had no response for that. The murmurs in the room grew, some members watching with veiled interest, others waiting to see how Meredith would salvage her dignity. A few, Arthur included, seemed entertained by the whole thing. But there were also those who weren't pleased. Older men in press suits, women who had long benefited from the carefully curated guest lists. They exchanged glances, subtle nods, silent understandings. Jade knew exactly what was happening. The resistance wasn't loud, not yet, but it was forming. A waiter hesitated before stepping between them, offering Meredith a fresh glass of champagne. She took it without acknowledgement, eyes still burning into Jade. "Well," she finally said, voice tight, "I suppose congratulations are in order?" Jade simply raised her glass. Meredith didn't drink. Instead, she turned to the group closest to her, tilting her chin up. "This club has always maintained a certain standard. I hope that isn't changing." It wasn't a statement, it was a warning. Arthur chuckled under his breath. "You mean your standard?" Meredith ignored him. Jade set her glass down with deliberate care, her fingers tapping once against the bar before she pushed away from it. She was done entertaining this. Stepping forward, she met Meredith's gaze head-on. "You should be careful," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "The world's shifting, Meredith. You might want to shift with it." Meredith's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but she stopped herself. Something in Jade's eyes made her hesitate. Jade held the silence for a beat longer before turning on her heel and walking toward the center of the room. The attention followed her, whispers trailing behind like shadows. She didn't care. She had other matters to handle tonight. At the far end of the club, past the velvet booths and low-lit chandeliers, a private section was tucked away behind frosted glass doors. The real power in the room sat there, away from the noise, away from the spectacle. And that was exactly where she was headed. A waiter, younger, nervous, hesitated as she approached. "Ma'am, that area is for—" "I know," she said smoothly, offering him a brief but firm look. "And I have an invitation." The waiter blinked, glancing over his shoulder at the looming glass doors before nodding, stepping aside. Jade pushed through. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Unlike the main room, the energy here was quieter, heavier. The air held a tension that came with wealth and influence, the kind that didn't need to flaunt itself. Seated around a circular table were 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in understated but undeniably expensive attire. They barely reacted to Jade's arrival, save for the man at the head of the table, who glanced up with a small smile. "Ah," he mused, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "I was wondering when you'd make your way over here." Jade slid into the empty chair across from him. "You knew I would." The man, Richard Langston, smirked. His salt and pepper hair was immaculately styled, his suit tailored to perfection. "I had a feeling." The woman beside him, Naomi Wu, crossed one leg over the other. "I assume Meredith had a meltdown?" Jade exhaled through her nose, a smirk ghosting her lips. "More or less." One of the other men, a sharp-eyed businessman named Victor Hale, leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "And? Are you satisfied?" Jade met his gaze evenly. "Not yet." Richard chuckled. "Good." Jade had spent years playing chess in rooms like this, where power wasn't about who had the most money, but who knew how to wield it. She had been patient, she had been strategic, and now she was at the table. Victor studied her for a long moment before nodding slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "Then, let's get started." Jade reached for the glass in front of her, lifting it slightly. Tonight wasn't just about making a statement. It was about what came next. Jade swirled the dark liquid in her glass, letting the moment breathe. The weight of the room pressed in, not suffocating but expectant. This wasn't the crowd that gasped in shock or whispered behind cupped hands. These were the decision-makers, the power brokers, the ones who controlled the tides without ever getting their feet wet. Richard Langston sat back in his chair, fingers tapping lazily against the rim of his glass. His eyes, sharp and calculating, never wavered from Jade's face. "You've certainly made an entrance tonight," he mused. Jade met his gaze without flinching. "That was the easy part." A slow smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. Across the table, Naomi Wu let out a quiet chuckle, tilting her head as she studied Jade with interest. Victor Hale merely watched, waiting, always measuring. "You do realize," Richard continued, "that membership alone doesn't guarantee a seat at this table." Jade leaned forward, resting her elbows on the smooth wood. "Of course. That's why I'm not asking for one." Victor raised a brow. "No?" Jade took a sip of her drink, letting the warmth spread before she set the glass down. "I'm here to make it clear that I'm not just passing through. You can pretend otherwise if you'd like, but we all know the truth. What happened out there tonight wasn't just about me. It was about the inevitable shift that's coming to places like this." Richard exhaled through his nose, amused. "And you think you're leading the charge?" "I don't need to," Jane said smoothly. "The change is happening whether you embrace it or not. I'm just positioning myself where I need to be when it does." A silence settled over the table, thick with understanding. Naomi, the only woman among them before Jade's arrival, set down her martini glass and studied Jade thoughtfully. "Tell me," she said, her voice silk over steel, "what exactly do you want?" Jade didn't hesitate. "Access." Victor's fingers drummed once against the table. "To what exactly?" "To what you guard so closely," Jay said, tilting her head slightly. "The kind of access that isn't granted with a membership card. You all know what I mean." Richard's smirk grew wider, though his expression remained unreadable. "And why should we give that to you?" Jade took her time, letting the tension stretch. Then, with practiced ease, she pulled a sleek black folder from her clutch and placed it on the table. A shift. Victor's gaze flickered downward. Naomi's lips pressed together, her interest deepening. Richard, however, merely raised a brow. "And this is?" Jade tapped a manicured finger against the folder. "Leverage." Richard let out a soft chuckle. "I do love a bold move." Slowly he reached forward, pulling the folder toward him before flipping it open. His expression didn't change as he scanned the contents, but Jade caught the small twitch in his jaw, the brief flicker of interest that told her everything she needed to know. Naomi glanced over his shoulder, her brows lifting slightly. Victor leaned in, expression unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Jade didn't need to look at the documents to know their weight. She had spent months gathering them, waiting for the perfect moment. They contained names, transactions, decisions made behind closed doors that, if brought to light, would shift the balance in ways none of them could afford. Richard shut the folder with a quiet snap. "You've certainly done your homework," he said. Jade leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "I always do." For the first time, Richard's smirk disappeared. The room, for all its luxury, felt momentarily colder. "You understand that making enemies in this circle isn't wise," Victor said, his voice smooth, deliberate. Jade held his gaze. "And neither is underestimating me." Naomi exhaled, shaking her head slightly, though there was the ghost of a smile on her lips. "I like her." Richard tapped the folder against the table once, as if weighing his next words. "So, let's say we grant you access." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "What exactly do you plan to do with it?" Jade smiled, slow and knowing. "Oh, don't worry, I don't plan to burn the house down." She paused, just long enough to let them think about it. "Unless, of course, I have to." A beat of silence. Then, to her surprise, Richard laughed. A full, genuine laugh, low and knowing. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "now that's interesting." Naomi raised her glass in Jade's direction. "Welcome to the game." Jade picked up her own drink, tapping the rim against Naomi's in a quiet toast. This wasn't about membership. It wasn't about proving herself. It was about stepping into spaces that were never meant for her and refusing to be pushed out. And the night wasn't over yet. Jade let the rim of her glass touch Naomi's with a quiet clink before setting it down, a small but deliberate smile resting on her lips. The game was set, the pieces moving, but this wasn't checkmate. Not yet. She could feel the undercurrent in the room, the unspoken calculations running behind Richard's smirk, the way Victor's fingers remained still against the table as though grounding himself in thought. Richard, ever the strategist, leaned back in his chair, his fingers idly tapping the edge of the folder she had placed before him. His expression was unreadable, but Jade knew better than to take silence as disinterest. "You've certainly shaken things up tonight," he mused, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed many attempts to shift the tides, most of which failed. Jade met his gaze, her expression calm. "I tend to have that effect." Naomi chuckled softly, taking another sip of her drink before setting it down. "And what do you expect to happen next?" Jade exhaled through her nose, glancing briefly toward the frosted glass doors that separated them from the rest of the club. "That depends on how certain people react." The room was still, but outside the world was moving. Meredith Kingsley would be licking her wounds, but she wouldn't stay quiet. Not for long. Jade knew women like her, ones who built their thrones on exclusivity, who had spent their lives curating power through access, through the deliberate denial of others. Meredith had been caught off guard tonight, but she wasn't the type to let humiliation settle. She would regroup, whisper in the right ears, and try to find a way to reassert control. Jade had no intention of giving her the chance. Victor finally leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "I hope you realize that a seat at this table, true access, doesn't come from just proving you belong here." His fingers tapped once against the surface. "It comes from ensuring others want you here." Jade tilted her head slightly. "Are you saying you don't?" Victor studied her for a long moment, then smirked. "I'm saying the people out there still think this place belongs to them. And if you shake the tree too hard, they'll burn the orchard to keep things the way they were." Jade exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then I guess we find out who's willing to adapt and who isn't." A slow, knowing look passed between them. The shift wasn't immediate, but it had already begun. Richard tapped the folder once more, his gaze flickering toward Naomi, then Victor, before settling back on Jade. "Tell me something," he said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. "What's your real endgame here?" Jade let a small smile pull at the corner of her lips. "I want what I'm owed." Silence. A weighted pause. Then Richard laughed, low and deep, shaking his head slightly. "You really don't rattle easy, do you?" Jade lifted her glass again, her fingers steady. "Not in the slightest." Naomi exhaled through her nose, amused. "You might actually make it." Jade didn't respond. She didn't need to. A knock at the door pulled their attention. One of the waitstaff stepped in, his expression neutral, but his presence alone meant something had shifted outside the glass. He approached Richard, leaning down to whisper something in his ear. Richard's expression didn't change, but Jade caught the slight twitch in his jaw, a flicker of something. Annoyance? Calculation? Something between the two? Finally, he waved a hand, dismissing the waiter before turning back to the table. "Looks like the inevitable has arrived." Jade arched a brow. "Meredith," Naomi supplied, not even bothering to hide her amusement. "And a few of her allies." Jade wasn't surprised. "How bad?" Richard smirked. "She's demanding a formal discussion with the board about your membership status." Naomi let out a soft chuckle. "Which means she's already lost." Jade leaned back, folding her arms. If she had power, she wouldn't be asking permission to use it. Victor let out a quiet laugh at that, shaking his head. She really does belong here. Richard sighed, rubbing his temple as though slightly exhausted by the theatrics waiting beyond the glass doors. The problem isn't Meredith. The problem is the people who do have power and whether they feel like backing her play. Jade took another slow sip of her drink. Then let's make sure they don't. I nodded. Richard studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. Fair enough. He pushed the folder back toward her, untouched but acknowledged. We'll handle the board, you handle the floor. Jade picked up the folder, slipping it back into her clutch as she stood. I always do. She moved toward the door, feeling the shift in the air before she even stepped into the main room. The moment she crossed the threshold, the hum of conversation dulled, eyes subtly tracking her movements. Meredith stood near the bar, her posture rigid, flanked by a few familiar faces, ones who didn't bother hiding their distaste. Jade approached, slowly, deliberately, letting them see her, letting them feel the weight of her presence. She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head slightly. You called for me? Merida's lips pressed together before she lifted her chin. We need to discuss your membership. Jade exhaled through her nose, amused. No. You need to discuss my membership. I don't. A flicker of irritation crossed Merida's face, but she masked it quickly. This club has rules. Jade took another step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Meredith could hear. And yet, here I am. The older woman's jaw tightened. Jade let a slow smile pull at her lips. You've already lost, Meredith. You just don't know when to stop fighting. Meredith inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her clutch, but she didn't respond. Jade let the silence stretch, then leaned in just enough to whisper, Adapt or disappear. Your choice. She didn't wait for a response. Turning on her heel, she made her way toward the exit, her posture unshaken, her path unobstructed. She had won, and everyone in the room knew it.